Annie from Croakey here, and we're at the VICSERV Towards Recovery Mental Health Conference in Melbourne, and I'm talking to our keynote speaker, international keynote speaker, Dr Simon Duffy, who has a touch of jet lag, I believe. Simon, can you tell me where you're from?
Yes, I'm from the Centre for Welfare Reform, which is an independent think tank based in Sheffield, but with an international fellowship. And we kind of work around how to make welfare systems more socially just.
So that's an interesting thing. You started off this morning then talking about citizenship, but you put up a slide straight away and it said the welfare state is a good thing, but it's designed wrong. What's wrong with it?
It was designed, again, welfare states vary from country to country a bit, but across the developed world, welfare states really developed at a time when people had an enormous faith in government, and they expected government to do lots of things, some of which government is actually quite good at doing, and that's okay. Some things you need government to do, like let's have a good ambulance service or a good fire service. That stuff needs to be managed from on high, paid for through taxation, all good. But other things need to be controlled by citizens. Other things need to be controlled by families. Other things need to be controlled by communities. If you're not careful, you suck power and money and responsibility away from people, and you're left with a kind of bureaucratic mess, overly regulated, overly controlled, not really doing the best by people. And that's kind of happened a lot in welfare systems around the world, I would say.
That did beg the question, though, when you talk about that, does that not ultimately lead, as the MC Peter Mayer suggested, to what you've actually seen in the UK, where you've had the big society thing, which is let's strip away everybody else, let's move the services out of the way, let's cut the funding, and let's let the communities and the individuals solve the problem. Is that not the logical extension?
No, because why did we create the welfare state? We created the welfare state because without the power of the state and without principles of social justice, we're all... Can I swear on Croakey or no? Not really.
Not really badly, but you can a little bit.
Well, we're I don't know what. Not bad. Anyway, let me put it another way. Before the welfare state, we had war, revolution, terror, deep inequality. So what's the welfare state to do? It's there to prevent those things as a starter, and I suppose my point is that that's what I mean by design it well. You design it so that citizens have a high degree of control over their lives. You design it so families are strong. You design it so communities are strong. You design it so that we have low levels of income inequality. Now, these things require state action, but they require the right kind of state action, not any old state action. For people with disabilities and people with mental health problems, the paradoxes here are strong. In the peak population for the institutions was the 1970s in the UK, and in many countries, institutions for people with learning disabilities and mental health problems persist to this day, fully funded by the state. So my point is, you just can't be naive about this. It's the question is what and how the welfare state works. Only an idiot, and right-wing governments are examples of that, would believe we don't need one. But given that we do need them, why don't we want them to work really, really well?
So that was an interesting point, because and as we just discussed off the camera, ordinarily, I think a lot of keynote speakers challenge government when they stand up at a conference. You actually challenge the people in the room a little bit, talking about how deinstitutionalisation was... Everyone feels that we've done that because we moved a lot of people with mental health issues out of terrible hospitals and those kind of backgrounds into the community. You're saying we have to go further. Your challenge is actually to the sector. What are you telling them they have to do?
Yes, well, I'll break that into two parts. The reason I'm challenging people is that all good things that have happened in societies happen because citizens get organised and bring about change, including the change of challenging unjust settlements or unjust governments. So all real change comes from that. What are we really expecting? This is maybe the dangerous thing that we are expecting. We're expecting what? That we randomly elect a few politicians. They're so enlightened and wise that they introduce the most marvellous systems and reform. but hasn't worked for 70 or 80 years. Why would we think that just looking upwards and expecting good things to rain down on us will happen? No, people need to get organised, mobilised, but they also need to take responsibility for the things they can change. If we go to the institutions and the closure programmes, certainly in the UK, I don't know about in Australia, those were led by families, people with disabilities and professionals themselves. It wasn't led by government. Government came very late to the party. They were required because we needed funding systems to change, but all of the good stuff that's happened has been led by individuals, led by families, led by citizens.
So you gave a few examples of where you basically feel that services have lost their way a little bit with people. Can you give a couple of those?
Well, I think I was mostly giving examples of what I think of as kind of innovative alternatives, wasn't I? So I suppose one of the examples I gave, I was talking about an organisation called Women's Centre, which is in Halifax in the north of England, which I just think is a fabulous organisation. It's a mixture of women who've been through trauma volunteering their time, women living in trauma, and some very expert folk with varied professional backgrounds, also women. And as kind of in that triangle, working together and overcoming the most dreadful problems in people's lives, domestic violence, mental illness, abuse, and on and on. Now, I suppose when I did the research about Women's Centre and looked at what they were doing, what they were doing at a very low cost level, very efficient, very effective, compared starkly with existing social work systems, existing healthcare systems. And one of the most stark and kind of upsetting things is, in a way, when you realise how dreadful things are for many of these women, and then you discover that actually all of the statutory services that we pay millions and millions of pounds for keep passing these women on because they're too complex for the statutory services. Does that, I mean, that's the dreadful paradox. If we've actually the people in the most difficult circumstances, it's as if the welfare state says, oh, hang on, yes, we've spent 50% of GDP on this thing, but that problem's too difficult for us. We'll leave it to local women to sort out. I mean, that's not right, is it? I don't think.
No, but what you're saying is that effectively, I know, it almost is that we need to go back to the 70s where a lot of services emerged from that kind of momentum, and I think I've heard that a little bit out of the UK more generally. But you also pointed to the fact that the government control over funding of the welfare sector means that the sector can't do any advocacy, can't speak out against it. So basically, what would you say to somebody working in mental health in Australia in an environment, as we've said, where the NDIS is coming in, where there's a federal election? What do you do to make this change?
Well, I think one of the joys of the modern world, despite all the difficulties, is it's really easy to mobilise people around powerful ideas if you've got the will to do it. So if people want to mobilise against the great income inequality, for instance, which exists in, Australia and the UK about neck and neck as being two of the most unequal countries in the world, and income inequality is one of the major conditions that increases mental illness. Okay, so if you believe in mental health, you should be against high levels of income inequality. Campaign about that, organise around that. You don't need the government to do that. For heaven's sake, you're organising a campaign against the government. You're trying to change tax and benefit policies fundamentally, which is what drives this, and salary policies, which is what drives this. But also be true to those beliefs. I guess that's one of the challenges, I would say. I do think a lot of organisations, if they're not careful, their main purpose becomes surviving. Their main purpose becomes earning more money. We have a major charity that's meant to represent people with intellectual disabilities in our country. Its chief executive earns £175,000 a year. That's $350,000 a year. I don't know. I haven't checked salary rates in Australia, but in UK terms, that's one hell of a heck of money. And then when asked whether she could campaign against cuts and against and lobby government, she said, no, we can't be seen to be lobbying government. And that organisation is partially funded by central government. So we have major peak body charity meant to represent people, and actually it's not. But people are being paid handsomely to run those organisations. So I think those are the things when we've got to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what are we really doing? Why are we at work? Is this about the work? Is it about the paycheck? Or is it about something more important?
And sitting here and having people come up to you after your discussion, and I note that you arrived here on Sunday, but you do know Australia well, I think. What's your sense of what are the big issues that the sector is actually struggling with?
Well, I mean, I've been coming to Australia probably once a year for about 5 years now, and mostly people have invited me over here because of my work around self-directed support, what in Australia is called either the National Disability Insurance Scheme or consumer-directed care in aged care, and there've been talk about other reforms in mental health that might be like that. So people ask me about that because a lot of my working life has been about creating those kind of innovations that give people with disabilities control over funding, or give people with mental health problems control over funding. Now, what's the big challenge in Australia, I think, is, well, what is very striking is, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but you have begun in a kind of exciting way to suddenly embrace these ideas. Australia actually held back. Australia has not been a leader in this area internationally until the last 5 or 6 years, and suddenly it's showing a lot of interest.
You mean with the NDIS?
But also consumer-directed care, and so suddenly there's a lot more interest in ordinary citizens having control of funding that's for mental health services or for disability services or for aged care services. So that's a big change. That's a good thing, because it's we know internationally that brings about positive improvements in people's lives. Australia's set about doing that in a very interesting way. You've created a whole new bureaucracy to do it. You've decided to do one big experiment all at the same time for 500,000 people. You've decided to use some very elaborate technology in order to develop this new methodology. I hope it works, because it's the most exciting thing internationally, NDIS particularly, but also the consumer-directed care is also very important. I really hope it works, but I've never seen anything work quite like this, so I'm worried. And when I come to Australia, I see a lot of worried faces, because people are torn between the excitement on the one hand and the fear on the other hand.
And what's your fear?
You'll be eaten by the bureaucracy, that they won't really let go, that the whole thing will become an expensive mess. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that is definitely my fear.
So who can make that not happen?
People with disabilities and families, and good professionals. I mean,
what can they learn from?
Well, I think learn from their own experiences, number one. I mean, that's what you hear. When I'm in touch with quite a lot of people in the disability movement in Australia, and I have a lot of confidence that these folk know very well what they're looking for and will hold the system to account when they don't get it. So that makes me much more cheerful. But if things go badly, then you need to maintain that level of organisation. You need to make sure that people with disabilities are also working with families. I mean, again, this notion of carers, that Australia, like the UK, has replaced the term family with this rather weird word carer. I don't know quite why we've done that. Families and people, as much as possible, need to stand side to side. And in addition, I think don't cut out good service providers and good professionals. A lot of social innovation is also either generated by people like that or comes out of good partnerships. If you're going to try and defend things, the good things, or change towards something better, you really need practical instances. You can't just wave your hands around and say this is horrible, because in a way then you just give the power back. Does that make sense? So you need to offer people something. We want this, and this is how you do it.
We're in the middle of an election campaign. What are the lessons to learn from the UK government at the moment?
don't elect a vicious right-wing government.
Okay.
That would be my
top
tip for Australia.
What do they do in mental health and disability?
We've just seen targeting of people with disabilities for cuts. The UK is much weaker advocacy around disability, and we have allowed benefits to be cut so that people are impoverished. Social care, which is the disability support systems, have been radically cut. Groups have been divided one from another. People with mental health problems committing suicide in higher numbers because of policy changes which are pushing people through objectionable assessment systems around their disability, supposedly helping people into work, but actually just impoverishing people and not giving people work. I could go on. It's not a pretty picture. I'm not saying that your Liberal government is going to do that. Partially, I suspect that they're more accountable to people with disabilities. But don't be naive, is what I'd say. What we've learned in the UK is things that for decades people would thought would never happen. Nobody would ever do anything like that, have happened like that.
And the issue, of course, the problem with the NDIS is if it fails, it's going to fail spectacularly, isn't it? And you won't come back to that for many governments.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I don't know if it'll... I'm not sure I accept the premise. Bureaucracies are really good at managing failure, actually, in the sense that they never want anything to appear to have failed. So if it fails, in one sense, I don't even, let's say it massively overspends, which is probably the major risk for it. I think what they will try and do is wrestle it back under control. I don't think that will necessarily be a pretty picture, but I'm not sure it is a spectacular failure. I mean, if the politics is wrong, then some politician might want to turn it into a spectacular failure, but that will be because you've got the politics wrong. Bureaucracies overspend all the time.
I guess that was my worry, that if it gets to the stage, and there is a lot of worry about the way, especially in mental health, but also about the whole pricing for services, and also just what, as you've brought up a lot, what choice actually means.
Yes.
If there's that much criticism of it, can you undermine the government's willingness to fund it?
Well, yes. I don't know. It's hard for me to judge. I mean, I have certainly been critical, but I assume that as an occasional visiting Englishman, my criticisms are not really going to make any political difference. I certainly hope they don't. If I felt that my criticisms were undermining NDIS, then I would stop doing it, because I'd much rather you made that mistake than not do anything. It's such an important thing. But yeah, I'd like people to be mindful. I think it's a bit funny that we do kind of over-worry about these things too much, in a sense that this is part of the political process. Challenge, question. I think that's perfectly reasonable. And maybe that's the danger, that we turn NDIS into some kind of... it's all in some kind of strange bubble that can't be touched, because if it was touched or amended or improved, it would all fall apart. Nothing's really like that. It's another human institution. The thing about it at the moment is it is still at a very early stage. There are good people inside it trying to make it better, and it's at an early stage of spending, and there's lots of clever people watching that very closely. So while I wouldn't have designed it like they designed it for all sorts of reasons, I'm not so despairing or worrying. I think clearly, if you're a service provider at this time, you're worrying about your future. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of natural. But yeah, I would just say to the disability movement to stay strong and just carry on. Don't be told you can't challenge. I mean, I think that could just be the system pushing you back. Just challenge on both fronts. We want adequate funding, we want this to work, we want it to work quickly, but we also want high levels of control, we want high levels of flexibility. I don't see what's so unreasonable about that. I think people saying, don't criticise us, it'll all fall apart, is a little bit... I mean, I think that's a very immature reaction, don't you? NDIS is made by Australians together. It isn't some little funny, fragile piece of china sitting on a mantelpiece. You touch it too much, it'll fall off and break.
Very nice. Thank you very much. Everyone's gone back into the session. Are you in one?
No, I've said I'd go and see somebody who wants to have a chat, so I'm going to go and have a chat.
Then I shall for you. Thank you so much, Simon.
It was a
Fantastic to
pleasure.
talk to you.
Yeah, thank you.